In this tutorial, we're going to learn how to use the Diagnostic Get File Encodings plugin for the Butter text analysis software. What this plugin will do is allow us to read in a bunch of text or text-based files and try to algorithmically determine what file encoding they have. Now, the topic of file encodings is actually fairly complicated, and it's something we're not going to get into in much depth in this tutorial. What's important to know is that in order to accurately read a file, or display text even, it's usually important to know what encoding that text actually has. If you've ever opened up a web page or a document and seen broken characters like this, usually that means that the text has an encoding that is being misread, or more accurately, that the encoding that's trying to be used to parse your text doesn't match what the actual text encoding is. If you've seen other tutorials for Butter and Butter plugins, you've probably noticed that this is a common thing that comes up in the different plugin settings. It'll ask you specifically what your input text encoding is, and the same is true for output files as well. It'll ask you what encoding you want to use when you're saving your output file. Now these days, for the most part, UTF-8 is kind of considered the default encoding. Most text on the internet and text that you would encounter in modern day computing is going to be in some variant of UTF-8 encoding. That's not necessarily always true, but for our purposes, that's generally true. But often, if you have text files or text-based files, which includes things like CSV files or tab-delimited files, things like that. If you have text-based files that come from another country than what you're used to computing in, or if they come from an older computing system, or sometimes even just a different computing system, you may not know exactly what the encoding is of the files that you're working with. What that means is that when you go to use other plugins where you need to know the text encoding so that you don't end up with broken text that's getting read in, you have to figure that out somehow. Now, there's no perfect way to determine what a file's encoding is today. That may change someday in the future as standards change, but for now, the best way to do it generally is to use an algorithm to try to determine, based on the data in the file, what the file's encoding is. What this plugin does is it uses some established algorithms to try to determine that automatically, and then gives you output that tells you what those encodings are most likely to be. Now we notice that this is a top-level plugin, which means it needs to sit at the top of an analysis pipeline plugin chain. So we'll go ahead and add this here, and then we'll go ahead and go to these plugin settings. And there are a few things that you can see going on here. The first is that it asks us to specify what the text file extension is that we want to look for. So by default, this is just any file that begins, any file that ends with .txt. So this is the file extension. Now this can also be changed to things like CSV, TSV, HTML. Any type of file that is text-based, you could technically use this plugin to work on. For now, we'll just stick with TXT files. The next thing we want to do is choose what folder contains the TXT files that we want to analyze. So here I have some TED Talks that are contained in TXT files, as well as within a couple of subfolders. So we'll choose this folder. And the last option is include subfolders. Do we want to scan all of these subfolders of this folder we just selected? In this case, yes we do. What this will do is recursively search all of the folders that are contained in this main folder that you've selected here. So if you have subfolders within subfolders, by checking this box, you'll be able to scan all of the subfolders for .txt files. Now, in order to use this plugin to the most benefit, what you'll want to do is attach the Save Output to CSV plugin right underneath here. We can see that this plugin has an output type of output array, And the save output to CSV file, or I'm sorry, the save output to CSV plugin will take output array as one of its input types. So we can just connect them exactly like this. We'll choose where we want to put our output CSV. And then we'll go ahead and run this. And it should move very quickly. And if we go and look inside of the output file that we just generated, we see a number of columns. So in the first column, we can see the actual file names that were read in by the plugin. These two columns aren't really important here. We can see the full path for the file that was read in. We can see a little bit of metadata about the file. We can see when the file was created, how big the file is, and we can see what the encoding of the file is as it's determined by this plugin. Now these won't always be 100% accurate. Here you can see the encoding confidence for all of these. The confidence is 1 or 100%. But sometimes you'll see lower confidence in the encodings. For the most part, you can use this as kind of a fuzzy guess as to what the encoding is for each file. If you have a folder full of text files and they all came from the same source, and the majority of them have a specific encoding, or I should say, this plugin guesses that the majority of them have the same encoding, you can probably assume that they all have the same encoding, even if one or two of them were guessed as something else. And that's it. That's how you use the Diagnostic Get File Encodings plugin for Butter.